Grace Reynolds had never been the type to seek the spotlight. Her world was disciplined, quiet, deliberate, built around the steady rhythm of breath, control, and the sacred geometry of movement. In a modest dojo tucked between a row of laundromats and a shuttered barbershop on the south side of the city, she spent her days teaching martial arts to children who had been told all their lives they were too loud, too wild, too broken to be worthy of guidance. But Grace saw something else in them, fragments of her younger self, angry, isolated, misunderstood, and searching for meaning. For Grace, the art was more than kicks and stances. It was a language of survival, a form of resistance, and a blueprint for dignity in a world that so often tried to strip people like her of exactly that. She lived simply, wore her natural hair in tight coils, and drove an old Camry with a crack along the windshield that spiderwebbed like the story of her life, fractured, yet holding strong. Her mornings began with prayer and push-ups. Her evenings ended with meditation and silence. Everything in between was poured into her students, her community, and her younger sister Ava, a fiercely bright college student with dreams of law and justice dancing in her eyes. But beneath Grace's composure simmered the scars of past battles. She had tasted poverty, witnessed violence, and stared down the barrel of racism in more forms than she could count. And yet she had mastered one truth. If the world wouldn't grant her peace, she'd create it within herself. It was this strength, quiet and unshakable, that made her so beloved and so dangerous. Because there's nothing more threatening to a broken system than a black woman who refuses to be broken by it. Still, no amount of poise could prepare her for what was coming. The day started like any other, humid, ordinary, forgettable. She was on her way back from the grocery store, her trunk loaded with canned beans, frozen tilapia, and protein bars for her students. She had just pulled into a parking spot near her building when she noticed a commotion at the corner. A teenager, dark-skinned and lanky, was being pressed against a police cruiser by a white officer whose body language screamed something more than routine. Something angry, something eager, something volatile. Grace didn't have to know the full story. She had seen enough. The stiffness of the officer's grip, the way the boy flinched but didn't resist, the look of helplessness on his face. It was all too familiar. She stepped forward, calm but resolute, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. A witness, nothing more. A protector, if fate allowed. But in America, a black woman stepping forward often reads as a threat, especially to men in uniforms who mistake authority for immunity. What happened next would alter the course of her life forever. The officer, Jack Carter, a man with a chest full of medals and a mind full of assumptions, turned his gaze toward Grace with something between disdain and suspicion. She didn't know it then, but Jack had a history. Complaints buried, footage erased, whispers that never reached the news. And now, here he was, misreading a calm stance as defiance, a raised voice as aggression, and a plea for de-escalation as an act of rebellion. She didn't raise a fist. She didn't make a move. But still, within minutes, she was in handcuffs, face down on the hot concrete, her groceries spilled beside her like the debris of dignity. Jack's grip was brutal, his voice cold. Her students watched from across the street. Her sister's call went unanswered. Her rights were never read. Someone pulled out a phone. The recording began. And just like that, the storm she had been training her whole life to survive finally arrived. The footage was 23 seconds long. No music, no editing, no filters. Just raw, trembling hands holding up a phone as a woman was slammed against the pavement like her existence had been deemed illegal. No context, no explanation. Just violence, loud, unapologetic, and painfully familiar. By the time Grace Reynolds was processed and left in a holding cell that stank of cold metal and mildew, her name was already being whispered across group chats, community forums, and timelines. The video had spread like a spark on dry leaves. At first, it was only the neighborhood, mothers who knew her, kids she had trained, elders who remembered her showing up at neighborhood cleanups and school board meetings. But by the evening, hashtags were forming. By midnight, national pages had picked it up. A black woman, unarmed, arrested, brutalized in broad daylight for doing nothing but witnessing. And suddenly, The narrative wasn't hers anymore. For years, Grace had chosen silence as her protest. Dignity in the face of ignorance. Composure in the face of injustice. But now, the world had peeled her private pain into a public stage. Commentators weighed in. Strangers debated her tone, her posture, her clothing, as though anything she had done could justify what had been done to her. Some praised her calm. Others picked her apart with surgical cruelty. And all the while, the woman herself sat in a 6x8 cell, her wrists bruised and her voice quiet, replaying every second in her mind like a looping nightmare. The morning after her arrest, Grace was released without charges. No apology, no explanation, just her belongings in a plastic bag. Her dignity crumpled under the weight of the system. Outside the precinct, Ava was waiting, red-eyed, furious, arms crossed like she was holding herself together by force. Grace didn't say much. She never did. But the look they exchanged said everything. This wasn't over. And deep inside her, something shifted. For so long, Grace had kept her head down. She had believed that if she worked hard, stayed composed, uplifted her people, she would be safe. That she could be the exception. But that illusion died the moment her face hit the pavement. It wasn't about her behavior. It never had been. It was about perception, prejudice, and power. She had followed every rule, and still, she was treated like a threat. That afternoon, the dojo remained closed. For the first time in years, she didn't teach a single class. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, phone in hand, staring at the video someone had sent her. She watched herself from the outside, calm, respectful, offering no threat, and yet restrained, shoved, arrested. The video wasn't just a window into her pain. It was proof. And it burned. Across the city, reactions intensified. Protesters gathered outside the police precinct by nightfall. Signs were raised. Chants filled the streets. But Grace remained inside, wrestling not with the injustice. She had always known it was there, but with the unwanted role she had now inherited. She hadn't asked to be a symbol. She had only wanted peace. It was Ava who pushed the conversation. The younger sister had always been more fire than Grace, the kind to raise her voice, challenge professors, quote Baldwin with fury. Now, she urged Grace to speak up, to go public, to reclaim the narrative before others wrote it for her. "You're more than just what happened to you," she had said. "You're what happens next." But Grace wasn't sure she was ready to carry that weight. Her dojo had been her sanctuary, her silence, her shield. But that shield had been cracked wide open. She could no longer disappear into discipline. The community was watching. The country was watching. And somewhere in the depths of her resolve, a new voice began to rise. Not loud, not angry, but clear. A voice that said, "If I survive this, I have to make it mean something." She closed the video, stood up, and looked at herself in the mirror. The bruises would fade. The scars might not. But from this day forward, she would no longer fight only in silence. The battle had just begun. Grace wasn't the only one who had been changed by that 23-second video. For Ava, the impact had gone deeper, sharper, like a shard of glass she couldn't dislodge. Watching her sister, her calm, composed, untouchable sister, reduced to a broken figure on the sidewalk, had snapped something inside her. And when Ava broke, she didn't weep. She organized. Within 48 hours of Grace's release, Ava had drafted a public statement, reached out to civil rights attorneys, and set up a media page titled Justice for Grace. She was a force no one could contain. Where Grace moved like water, measured and disciplined, Ava burned like fire, relentless and loud. And that contrast was precisely what this moment demanded. Grace, still raw from the assault, found it difficult to process the sudden flood of attention. Reporters called. Activists stopped by. Old students dropped off flowers and handwritten letters, calling her their champion. But inside, she didn't feel like a hero. She felt exposed, uneasy, as though she were walking around without skin. Ava didn't let her retreat for long. "This isn't just about you," she reminded her. "This is about every woman who's been silenced, every brother who's been brutalized, every mother who's watched her child walk out the door and prayed they'd come home." Grace listened in silence. She had heard all of it before, on the news, in classrooms, in whispered family stories, but it sounded different now. This wasn't theory. This was lived. It was her bruises, her breath knocked out, her body made into a battleground. Then came the email. It was unsigned, sent from an encrypted account, but the message was clear. I was there. I have the bodycam footage. It tells a different story than the one they're pushing. If she wants justice, tell her not to give up. The moment Grace read it, her heart tightened. Someone inside the department had seen what happened. Someone had a conscience, and someone was scared. It was the first crack in the wall of silence that police misconduct had built for decades. Ava wanted to release the message immediately, but Grace hesitated. She had learned that timing was everything, and so was trust. Instead, they contacted a civil rights attorney named Naomi Westbrook, a sharp-witted woman with a courtroom presence that could silence a room. Naomi had taken on the system before, and won. When she met Grace, she didn't ask for her story. She already knew it. What she needed was her decision, fight or fade. Grace chose to fight. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No fist in the air. No stirring monologue. Just a quiet nod and the words, "Let's do it right." Naomi began building the case. Ava handled the public messaging. Grace, meanwhile, had to learn to live in the in-between, a space where she was no longer anonymous, but not yet vindicated. Strangers approached her on the street, calling her brave. Some shared their own stories, some offered hugs, others just stared. She wasn't Grace the instructor anymore. She was Grace the survivor, Grace the symbol. And with that came a strange kind of grief for the life that had been taken, and the new one being forced upon her. Late at night, she'd lie awake and remember her mother's words. Sometimes, you don't get to choose when the fight finds you, but you do get to choose how you meet it. And she had made her choice. The days blurred. The protests grew. Donations poured into the legal fund. And then came the first major step, the city council hearing. Ava urged Grace to speak. "They need to see the face behind the footage," she said. Grace stood before the council in a room packed with cameras, supporters, and skeptics. Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't waver. She told the truth, not just about the arrest, but about the fear, the silence, the quiet dignity she had tried to live by, and how it was ripped away in 23 seconds. Some clapped, some cried, and somewhere in that room, someone finally started listening. The storm had begun, but Grace wasn't backing down. She was just getting started. Jack Carter wasn't a bad man, at least. That's what he told himself in the quiet moments when the world wasn't watching. He had worn the badge for 12 years, survived riots, shootings, endless shifts that bled into one another. He had buried 2 friends killed in the line of duty. He'd saved lives too. Talked a man down from a bridge once. Bought groceries for a single mom who was stealing baby formula. But none of that mattered now. Not when one video had turned him from officer to villain overnight. The morning after the incident, Jack sat in the back office of the precinct while Internal Affairs reviewed his bodycam footage. He hadn't watched it himself. He didn't need to. He remembered every second. Grace Reynolds. Calm. Defiant. Too calm. Too defiant. Something in her presence had threatened him, though he couldn't explain it. She hadn't raised her voice, but she'd challenged his authority in a way that felt dangerous. And he had reacted, not out of duty, but out of fear disguised as control. Now, that reaction was his undoing. The captain didn't say much, just looked at him with tired eyes and muttered, "You're on leave until further notice." No apology, no anger, just bureaucracy, cold and bloodless. Jack turned in his gun and badge. The metal felt heavier than it ever had in his hands. Outside the station, news vans lined the sidewalk. Protesters shouted his name, called him a monster, a racist, a disgrace. He kept his head down, but their voices followed him like shadows he couldn't outrun. At home, the silence was louder. His wife, Karen, had taken the kids to her mother's place 2 days earlier. "It's not safe here," she had said, not quite meeting his eyes. She didn't argue, didn't yell, just packed a bag and left, like someone evacuating before a storm. And maybe that's what he was now, a storm. Alone in the house, Jack scrolled through the coverage. The video. The headlines, the outrage, over and over again. Each clip chipped away at the version of himself he had spent years constructing. In his mind, he was a man of discipline, a man of law. But the world didn't see that. They saw a brute, a symbol of everything wrong with the system. And for the first time, he began to wonder if they were right. He poured a glass of whiskey, then another. But the alcohol couldn't drown out the image of Grace's eyes staring up at him, calm, unyielding, wounded. She had looked at him not with fear, but with something worse, disappointment. Like she had expected this, like she had seen it all before. The emails started trickling in. Threats, accusations. One simply read, "You're what our sons fear." But there was one message that stood out, from someone inside the force. No name, just words. "We both know that bodycam footage doesn't match your report. They're going to protect the department, not you. Be ready." That was the first time Jack felt real fear. Not the kind he had felt on the street. The kind that seeps into your bones and whispers, "You're not in control anymore." He hadn't just endangered his career. He had become a liability, a political inconvenience. And soon, he knew, he'd be sacrificed for the sake of public image. Not because they believed Grace, but because they needed to be seen believing her. Jack stared at his reflection in the living room mirror. The face looking back was tired, grizzled, and unsure. He had once believed in law and order. Now all he saw was chaos. For the first time, he wondered what justice would look like if it wasn't in his hands. And that question would haunt him, day after day, as the truth inched closer and the walls began to close in. The city did not sleep that week. It breathed in protest, cried in chorus, and pulsed with the fury of 1,000 unheard stories. Grace Reynolds stood at the edge of the chaos, watching her name ripple across signs, hashtags, and chants. She never asked to be the face of a movement, but when your pain becomes public, you lose the luxury of anonymity. The video had gone viral, yes, but what had really caught fire was something older, something deeper. Injustice, long buried under silence and resignation, had found a vessel. And Grace? She was that vessel now, whether she wanted to be or not. At first, she tried to stay quiet. Let the lawyers speak. Let the organizers march. But every time she looked in the mirror, she saw not just the bruises on her skin, but the ones on her spirit. Her dojo was still closed. Her students scattered. Her name now synonymous with the incident. But what haunted her more was the whisper in her own mind. If not me, then who? So, when the invitation came, a peaceful rally on the steps of City Hall, Grace said yes. She wore all black, not because it was dramatic, but because it reflected the mood of her heart. Her sister, Maya, stood by her side, holding her hand tight like they did as children when storms rolled in. But this storm wasn't passing. It was gathering. Hundreds gathered before them, young and old, black, white, Latino, Asian. Some carried signs with Grace's face on them. Others held candles. Some just stood with fists raised, eyes what with rage or hope or both. The civil rights lawyer, Darnell Pierce, introduced her. A man of powerful words and sharper purpose. He spoke of justice not as a dream, but as a demand. We are not here to ask for change. We are here to be it. Then he handed her the mic. Grace stood for a moment in silence, letting the weight of it all settle in her chest. She was not a speaker. She was a fighter. But tonight, words would have to be her weapons. "I'm not here to tell you what you already know," she began, voice steady but low. "You've seen the video. You've seen my face in the dirt. You've heard the silence that followed. What you haven't seen is what happens after the cameras stop." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I've trained for years to control my body, my anger, my fear, but nothing prepared me for the feeling of a knee in my back while the world watched and did nothing. Nothing prepared me for how much it hurt, not just physically, but spiritually. To be treated like a threat, like a thing." The crowd was silent now, clinging to every syllable. "I am not just a headline. I am not a hashtag. I am a woman, a teacher, a sister, a daughter, and I will not apologize for surviving." Applause erupted, raw and explosive. But Grace didn't flinch. She wasn't finished. "To Officer Carter, if you're watching this, I want you to know, I don't hate you. I don't even want revenge. I want truth. I want accountability. And I want a world where my students can walk outside and not wonder if today is the day someone mistakes their confidence for defiance. That line cracked something open, in the crowd, and in herself. When she stepped down, Maya wrapped her in a fierce hug. And for the first time since the incident, Grace allowed herself to cry. Not out of sorrow, but release. She had spoken her truth, and now it belonged to the world. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that somewhere across the city, in a quiet apartment, a conflicted young officer was preparing to make a decision that would set the next fire. Because the bodycam footage, it told a different story, and someone was finally ready to let it be seen. While chants echoed in the streets and Grace's face lit up protest signs across the city, far from the glare of flashbulbs and interviews, a young man sat alone in his modest apartment, wrestling with a truth that weighed heavier than any badge. His name was Ethan Morales, a junior officer who had been present during Grace Reynolds' arrest. Not prominent in the video that went viral, not seen, not blamed, but there nonetheless, silent, compliant, afraid. Ethan hadn't joined the force to become a cog in a machine of silence. He believed in duty, in justice, in doing the right thing. But that night, that one night had broken something inside him. He had stood frozen as Jack Carter slammed Grace to the ground. He had watched her dignity stripped under flashing red and blue lights. And worst of all, he had said nothing. But Ethan hadn't just watched. He had recorded. Every officer's body cam had been active that night, but only some footage made it into the official report, heavily redacted, distorted by bureaucratic sleight of hand. The footage from Carter's cam was mysteriously corrupted, another conveniently incomplete. But Ethan's? It was clear. Painfully, unforgivably clear. He had kept a copy on a flash drive, buried deep in a drawer. For weeks, he told himself it wasn't his place to expose it, that he'd be risking his job, his pension, his safety. But after hearing Grace speak at the rally, after seeing the sheer raw humanity in her trembling voice, Ethan realized silence was no longer a shield. It was complicity. His hand shook as he copied the footage onto a new drive. His resignation letter was already written, folded neatly in his coat pocket. He wasn't naive. He knew what could happen to cops who turned against their own. They called it crossing the blue line. But Ethan didn't want to wear a uniform built on fear. He wanted to look in the mirror and see someone his mother would be proud of. That night, under the cover of darkness, he drove to Darnell Pierce's law office. The civil rights attorney was no stranger to late-night knocks. But when he opened the door and saw the nervous officer standing before him, he didn't speak. He just stepped aside. Ethan placed the flash drive on the desk. "It's all there," he said quietly. The arrest. The things they didn't want seen. The part where she was already on the ground. Where Carter hit her again. Where she cried out. And we just stood there. Pierce stared at him, expression unreadable. "Why now?" "Because the truth doesn't change just because I waited," Ethan whispered. "But maybe someone will." The lawyer nodded. No fanfare. No applause. Just two men in a quiet office, finally choosing courage over comfort. By morning, the footage was everywhere. National news, social media, podcasts. The silence that had cushioned the department shattered into 1,000 pieces. The video showed Grace surrendering, her voice calm. Then came the sudden shove, the takedown, the brutality no spin doctor could polish. The world watched again, but this time, through an unfiltered lens. Officer Jack Carter was placed on immediate suspension. The department scrambled for damage control. Public officials issued carefully crafted statements. But nothing could rewind what had been captured. Nothing could bury what had now been seen. Grace watched it alone in her apartment, eyes unblinking. It was strange, seeing herself from the outside, reliving that moment not through memory, but through the cold clarity of footage. And yet, she didn't flinch. She had already survived it. Now she owned it. Her phone buzzed nonstop, calls from journalists, supporters, even celebrities. But the one message that mattered most came from an unknown number. "I was there. I should have stopped it. I'm sorry. I'm ready to testify." She stared at the message, then at her reflection. This wasn't the end. It was only the middle. And now, the world had no choice but to listen. The city was no longer just humming with unrest, it was roaring. The video had struck a nerve, one buried beneath years of denied justice, dismissed complaints, and carefully worded press releases. Grace Reynolds had become more than a name. She was now a symbol, a face, a reckoning. But symbols are double-edged, and the weight of being one was starting to crush the woman behind it. Grace stood in her tiny kitchen, hands gripping the edge of the counter, her phone buzzing endlessly with calls and texts. Her name trended with hashtags, her story dissected by pundits and activists alike. Strangers wanted her on their shows, in their interviews, at their protests. Everyone wanted a piece of her pain, served neatly with a side of applause. But none of them had stood beside her on the cold pavement that night. None had tasted the metal of handcuffs or heard the quiet tremble in her sister's voice the morning after. Hope, Grace's younger sister, watched her with quiet concern. She had been Grace's shadow since the arrest, hovering like a guardian too young for the role. Gone was the wide-eyed optimism of a college student. In its place stood someone hardened by the reality that heroes bleed, and sometimes the world applauds only after it draws your blood. "You don't have to do everything, Grace," Hope whispered one night, after yet another call from yet another news outlet. But Grace only shook her head. "It's not about doing everything. It's about not letting them do nothing." Outside, the protests swelled. Thousands marched, many wearing shirts emblazoned with Grace's face. Chants filled the air. Her name became rhythm, but with the attention came backlash. Anonymous threats in her inbox, whispered smears about her past, attempts to frame her as violent, unstable, ungrateful. The same cycle. Praise the survivor, then poison her legacy. Grace felt the pressure clawing at her sanity. The fight had moved beyond her control. She was no longer steering the story. It was steering her. Then came the fire. It started on a quiet Tuesday evening. A peaceful sit-in outside City Hall. Signs, candles, songs. But tension lingered in the air, thick as smoke. And smoke did come. First from a trash can kicked over by someone in a hood. Then from a Molotov cocktail thrown by a figure who vanished into the crowd before anyone could see the hand that tossed it. Chaos followed like a tidal wave. The media seized it immediately. Violence erupts at Reynolds' rally. Footage showed broken windows, overturned barriers. They didn't show the elders who tried to calm the crowd. They didn't show the organizers pleading for peace. Just fire shouts, and the implication that Grace had lit the match. She watched it unfold on TV that night, her jaw clenched, heart sinking. This wasn't justice, it was sabotage. Someone wanted to silence the movement by discrediting it, and they were starting with her. Hope sat beside her, eyes wide. "You have to say something." But Grace didn't respond. She stared at the screen, at her own face framed beside the flames, and realized something terrifying. This fight was no longer about proving her innocence. It was about surviving the consequences of being believed. In that moment, the silence in the room became louder than the sirens on the screen. She rose slowly from the couch, her shadow stretching long across the floor. "I'm not going to let them twist this," she said, voice like steel. "But how?" Hope asked. Grace turned, her expression unreadable. By showing them, they picked the wrong woman to burn. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not when the fire had finally lit something deep inside her that even fear couldn't reach. By the time the smoke cleared, both literal and figurative, Grace Reynolds found herself teetering between icon and scapegoat. Her face had become the rallying cry for thousands. Yet some now whispered that she had incited the violence. A few mainstream pundits danced around the word instigator. Others didn't dance at all. But while the world debated her innocence for a second time, something unexpected stirred beneath the surface. It didn't come from the protest lines or media spotlights. It came from within the very system that tried to bury her. Miles away from Grace's apartment, inside a dimly lit break room at the city's precinct, Officer Daniel Torres sat in silence, staring at a laptop screen. He had watched the arrest video a dozen times. He knew Jack Carter, trained with him, drank with him, trusted him once. But as he watched Carter shove Grace to the ground, then falsify the report claiming she had resisted, Daniel's got twisted. The truth was, Daniel had always known something was wrong with Jack. There were whispers, small complaints buried under paperwork, reports that disappeared, victims who stopped showing up. But no one ever pushed too hard. The blue wall was thick, and speaking out meant risking everything. But now, with a woman's life shredded in public and a city on fire, Daniel realized silence was no longer neutral. It was betrayal. He hesitated for days, but the guilt gnawed at him, a weight that wouldn't lift. He dug through old archives, combed through bodycam logs, and what he found was worse than he expected. Not only was Grace's footage altered, but Jack had a pattern. A chilling pattern of aggression against black civilians, each case buried beneath administrative language and legal gymnastics. And then, he made the decision that would change everything. Daniel sent an encrypted folder, videos, internal memos, falsified reports, to a civil rights organization working with Grace's attorney, Naomi Okoro. No name, no trace, just the truth. The files dropped like thunder. Grace was sitting with Naomi when the email arrived. At first, they thought it was a prank. But then Naomi's hands trembled. Her face went pale. She clicked play on the bodycam footage, unedited, raw. It showed everything. The unnecessary force. The lack of resistance. Jack's smug voice afterward, laughing with another officer. And then came the memo, clearly marked. Redact video for press inquiry. It wasn't just misconduct. It was conspiracy. Grace didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just stared, the weight of validation sinking in slowly like rain soaking into parched earth. She had been telling the truth, all along. And now, finally, the world would see what she saw that night. Not just an injustice, but a pattern. A system. Naomi's phone lit up with press calls before they could even finish reviewing the files. But Grace held up a hand. "Don't leak it to them yet," she said calmly. "Not just yet." Naomi looked confused. "Why not? This could flip everything." Grace's voice was steady. "Because I don't want justice to be rushed. I want it to be undeniable." That night, Grace released a quiet, written statement. No media frenzy. No viral hashtags. Just a message from her heart. For too long, pain has been proof. And even then, it wasn't enough. But now we have the truth. Not just for me, but for all those who didn't get a camera, who didn't get believed. This is for them, and I will not let it be wasted. By morning, the files were public. The fallout was immediate. Jack Carter was suspended. An internal investigation was launched. Protesters flooded the streets again, but this time with a deeper fire. Grace's name no longer represented just a victim. It symbolized vindication. Somewhere in his apartment, Daniel Torres watched it all unfold on TV, his badge lying face down on the table. He had chosen to become the whistle in the dark. And though he knew what it might cost him, for the first time in years, he slept soundly. Grace, too, sat quietly that night, watching the footage one last time. Not for pain, but for proof that the truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of clawing back into the light. The truth was finally out, but freedom never arrives without a cost. In the days that followed the release of the footage, Grace Reynolds found herself in the eye of a different kind of storm, quieter, colder, and more insidious than the first. She had become a symbol, but being a symbol is a lonely kind of victory. Public sentiment swung swiftly in her favor. News anchors now said her name with reverence instead of skepticism. She was invited to speak at forums, rallies, even national panels. But behind the scenes, something darker moved. Anonymous threats trickled into her inbox. Her training studio, once a safe haven, was vandalized in the dead of night. Windows smashed, the words liar and race baiter spray-painted in red across the walls. Grace stood in front of it the next morning, staring at the mess not with shock, but with a quiet understanding. This wasn't retaliation. It was fear of change. Naomi, her lawyer, urged her to consider police protection. But Grace declined. "I won't live under guard," she said firmly. "I've spent enough time being watched." But the hardest part wasn't the threats. It was the silence. The people she thought would stand beside her, the fitness clients who once praised her discipline, the neighborhood elders who clapped at her youth classes. They went quiet. Some crossed the street when they saw her. Others stopped calling altogether. Her name had become too loud, too political. People who once hugged her now looked away. And yet, she refused to be broken. She doubled down on her training, filling the echoing space of her studio with every punch, every breath, every disciplined move that reminded her of who she was before this began. Grace didn't train for vengeance. She trained for clarity, for peace. Meanwhile, the city was erupting in accountability. The mayor announced a sweeping review of police practices. The department launched a long-delayed civilian oversight board. Protesters held candles instead of signs, now marching with both grief and a growing sense of possibility. Grace watched from her window, often unseen, often aching with a strange sense of displacement. Because that was the paradox. She was both at the center and on the sidelines. This was her story, yet it had grown beyond her. Her name was chanted in streets she'd never walked, by children who didn't know her face, only her legend. But Grace never wanted to be a legend. She just wanted to be believed. And then, just when she thought the story was settling, it twisted once more. A confidential memo leaked. Jack Carter had been offered a quiet retirement package in exchange for a full resignation and non-disclosure agreement. No criminal charges, no public apology, just a clean exit. The news shattered Grace's fragile peace. She stood in Naomi's office, trembling not with anger, but with something deeper, betrayal, exhaustion, disbelief. Naomi, too, was livid. They're trying to bury him. Again. Like nothing happened. Grace didn't speak for a long time. She looked out the window, the city skyline smudged against the gray of evening. And then she said it, not as a request, but a vow. Then I'll go public. Not about what he did, about what they're doing now. The next day, Grace held a press conference, not surrounded by politicians or celebrities, but by survivors, women and men who had once been dismissed, ignored, or quietly silenced. Together, they told their stories, not for drama, but for justice. Grace's voice was calm, but it carried like thunder. You don't get to erase people's pain with paperwork. You don't get to retire your guilt. If justice doesn't come through their doors, then we'll bring it through ours. That night, the city woke up again. The narrative had shifted once more, from exposure to reckoning. Grace wasn't just demanding justice for herself anymore. She was demanding it for everyone who had been told, in countless subtle ways, that their pain was inconvenient. She had become the storm no one could outwalk. Months had passed since Grace Reynolds stood on that stage, speaking not just for herself, but for every silenced voice that never made it to a microphone. The city hadn't changed overnight. It didn't suddenly become just or kind, but something had shifted, a crack in the old walls, a soft trembling in foundations that had stood untouched for too long. Jack Carter had quietly vanished from public life. The department never confirmed his resignation, but his name stopped appearing in official records. No press release, no accountability, just absence. It was the system's signature move, sweeping debris under a carpet woven from decades of silence. But what they failed to understand was that Grace wasn't debris. She was legacy in motion. The studio reopened with fresh paint and stronger locks, not to keep people out, but to keep the vision intact. Grace taught again, children, survivors, elders. But something was different. Her movements were slower, more intentional. Her voice was gentler, but steadier. She wasn't just teaching martial arts anymore. She was teaching survival, dignity, and discipline of the soul. Naomi continued her advocacy, taking on cases with fiercer conviction. Andre, the whistleblower, left the force and started an accountability nonprofit. And Mia, Grace's sister, launched a podcast series titled Unseen Battles, archiving stories from everyday people caught in the web of systemic injustice. The world still spun with its usual chaos, new headlines, new outrages, new distractions. But for Grace, the world had narrowed into something clearer, a fight worth choosing every day. She often returned to the rooftop of her building at night. The city looked different from up high, not just taller, but older, wounded. It wasn't the enemy. It was a patient in recovery. Grace would sit there, breathing in the silence that once felt suffocating, but now felt earned. She thought about the day of the arrest, how small she had felt under Jack's gaze, under the weight of cold metal on her wrists. But now, in that same city, she had grown into something larger than humiliation. She had become voice, movement, resistance. And yet, in her heart, there was no hunger for revenge, only the ache for understanding. She realized then that her story wasn't just hers. It was part of something ancient, something aching to be named. Her pain was inherited. Her resilience, too. Systemic injustice doesn't always come with fists or batons. Sometimes it arrives in size, in silence, in the way people look away when they should lean in. Grace had learned to recognize it in all its disguises. And more importantly, she had learned not to carry it alone. As she stood to leave the rooftop that evening, a new chant echoed from a distant protest. They weren't chanting her name anymore. They were chanting something bigger. Justice. Truth. Grace smiled. Not because she was the center, but because she wasn't. That was the point. The movement had outgrown her, and that was the truest form of victory. Before heading downstairs, she pulled out her phone, recording a short video for her community. My name is Grace Reynolds. Some of you know what happened to me. Some of you lived your own version of it. What I want you to know is this: we are not isolated incidents. We are chapters in the same book. The system might try to close the page, but we are still writing. Together. Don't stop sharing your stories. Don't stop fighting for dignity. You matter, and I see you. She paused, and for the first time in a while, she felt light. If this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, or reflect, please don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe to keep stories like this alive. We're not just telling stories. We're building understanding, one voice at a time. With that, Grace walked back into the night, not as a victim, not even as a hero, but as a woman who refused to be erased. And in that refusal, she made space for us all. If Grace's story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on the power of voice, justice, and standing up for what's right. Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful, real-life stories that challenge the norm and elevate the truth. Your voice matters. Let's keep the conversation going.